Hello, 2322. This is my lecture on Shakespeare's sonnets. In Module 5, we're going to do Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor. So I might not go into a lot of detail here about his life and times. He's more famous, obviously, for his plays, but in his youth, he wrote sonnets, poetry. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on his poetry. There's not a lot known about his bio. Upper middle class upbringing. He went to good schools. He was married. His marriage was a shotgun wedding. So his wife was pregnant when they got married, but not a great deal is written about his daily life, his personal life. And I should also mention most critics see Shakespeare as the greatest writer in the history of literature. So it's really hard to gauge sometimes if he's being sarcastic, if a certain poem is written to one of his friends, if a character in a poem is fictional. He's such a good writer, and there's not much biographical information known. Maybe the best example of what I'm saying is Sonnet 144, which references the dark lady. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. If you want a little pop culture info, for some reason, 1600 Great Britain, men preferred blondes. And in this particular sonnet, if you just read it one time, you think he's insulting his mistress because she has dark hair, dark features, dark eyes. But the more you read it, the more you get used to his style. He's ultimately being sarcastic. He's saying, like, the women of the time are kind of generic. His mistress is beautiful and exotic, and he loves her even more because she's different. But again, there's no real biographical information on who that woman was, if in fact she was a real person, if she was his mistress. So you have to gauge his sarcasm poem to poem. You could do your own research and see what you find, but in some ways it's hard to tell. Certainly be thinking, we talked about Petrarch before, put your love on a pedestal. She can do no wrong. She's perfect. The idea of being in love with being in love. And then put these sonnets together. Maybe he's being sarcastic. Maybe he's saying something completely different. Critics who think Shakespeare was bisexual a lot of times go to these poems. Because there's a large section on a character he calls the youth. And you don't know if Shakespeare was in love with the youth. It was a real person. You don't know if the youth was a fictional character. You don't know if the youth is supposed to be Shakespeare when he was younger. And again, if you're gauging Shakespeare's sarcasm, in a random poem, instead of talking about how beautiful the woman is, he talks about how beautiful the youth is. So that's why some critics think Shakespeare may have been bisexual, but he was certainly married and had children as well. I'm looking on my theme sheet here. Some of the themes are time, love, jealousy, mortality, infidelity, homoeroticism, misogyny. So these were big themes of the day of 1600, and I think there was a certain Petrarchan pattern about how and why poets wrote about these themes. And Shakespeare sort of has his own style, his own reflection on what they mean. Certainly, there's a dichotomy between love and poetry and time and mortality. Go to work, make money versus sing and dance. Maybe that breaks down to like a business major versus an art major or something. But those things are in there. As I go down my list, sonnets 1 through 17 are about the youth. And my note says the youth should procreate, get married, and have kids. he spends a lot of time, the youth is beautiful and virtuous. And again, usually it's the object of the poet's affection, a girl on a pedestal that's beautiful and virtuous, but he says the youth is. And he says, have fun, live your life, get married, make babies, like be alive, be in the moment. Sonnets 18 through 126, I mentioned this about a minute ago, time and mortality against love and poetry. So there's plenty of time to go to work and get a job, support your family. He's telling the youth, go out, have fun, live your life, be in love, have sex, travel, spend money, drink, whatever, have a good time, enjoy your youth. So, I mean, I was thinking about COVID there for a second. So you should enjoy your life too. I worry about that. Then Sonnet 144, there's a love triangle between the narrator, a dark lady, and the youth. Critics who think Shakespeare is bisexual think maybe he was having an affair with the youth and the dark lady. But again, they might just be fictional characters, or Shakespeare might be thinking about his own youth and how he lived his life. Sometimes some critics have written books about certain poems are written to his friends, or certain poems are written to rival poets. Again, we don't know much about the history, so it's hard to tell. In general, I would say when you read these poems, kind of read them like an average person. If he's talking about love, maybe take the poem as being about love. If the poem's about time, youth, whatever, if you think too deeply, Shakespeare might lose you, or you might not get the historical reference. So on first reading, read it. I like that poem. Maybe that could be the subject of your paper, just because on first read you liked it. I included something about the lover's complaint, which is a longer accompanying poem. The plot is that a young woman is crying. She's destroying love letters. An old man comes by and asks her why. She says she was in love, but the guy seduced her. They had sex, broke her heart, and then he left. But she still loved him. So again, a lot of these poets of the time are talking about love, unrequited love. As I go on to the questions at the end about the Shakespeare sonnets, the first question says, pick a sonnet and explain what trope the sonnet is criticizing. So yeah, I mean, maybe like the most famous example is the dark lady, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. I think a lot of you might do that one for your paper. But he's supposed to say, you're beautiful, I can't do without you. He says, she's ugly, her eyes aren't like the sun, she has dark features, but he's kind of tricking the reader in 1600. He's kind of tricking us, depending on how closely we read. He's saying his love is exotic. So that goes against, praise your love as the greatest perfect creature there is. The second question, choose a sonnet from the youth section. What does the sonnet reveal about friendship between men during the early modern period? And again, a lot of critics argue that Shakespeare is bisexual. It's really hard to tell if these poems, or the youth in these poems, is a real person that he's in love with, a fictional character, Shakespeare reflecting on his own youth, so the youth in the poems is really him, or someone else entirely. He's making a side point to one of his friends, making a side point, a challenge to one of his rivals. But maybe pick that question if you want to talk about whether or not you believe Shakespeare is bisexual. And then the last one has to do with the dark lady. The most famous sonnet is my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. How does the poem actually praise the dark lady? So that sort of gives you a built-in thesis. The sonnet is fairly short, but you would go line by line and sort of trace his sarcasm and how ultimately, and I don't necessarily know why, like Great Britain 1600 liked blondes, but if you Googled it, like it would come up as such. So he is ultimately arguing that she is exotic and beautiful. She's not generic like everyone else. So I think that might be a popular question too, because the thesis kind of lines up and you can kind of break down how he's messing with tweaking the Petrarchan tradition. Okay, Shakespeare sonnets.